John Morgan here with the Keep Growing podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a new way of approaching gardening that's actually kind of based on previous history of gardening. So, in this week's episode, I thought it would be a good idea to first kind of give a quick rundown of the history of vegetable gardening in the U.S. So, if we jump all the way back to colonial times, I don't want to talk about large-scale agriculture, especially in the South, because, there's kind of a dark history surrounding that, and that's a topic for a whole other podcast. But what I want to talk about is kind of your average garden that you would have with an average family home. So in colonial times, and all the way up until the early 1900s, the main garden would have been the kitchen garden. And this was where a family would grow their seasonal vegetable crops. So these seasonal crops, it'd be cool weather crops like lettuce and cabbage. Then your warmer weather crops, but it was always kind of seasonal because up until the mid-1800s, there wasn't a reliable way to store these crops for long periods of time. Things like root crops and grains, though, they would be growing out in larger plots of land because they could be more easily stored. It wasn't until World War II that you kind of start to see gardens as how we kind of recognize them today. And during World War II, they developed what we know as victory gardens. Because of food rationing, they encouraged everyone to grow a victory garden to supplement their own food supply and to kind of be self-sufficient. And these were huge gardens with straight rows. That kind of became the standard idea of a garden. And after World War II, it kind of stuck around. And also after World War II, you had these factories that were producing things like nitrogen for bombs, and they converted over their factories and started producing nitrogen fertilizers. And that's really where you get into large-scale agriculture as we know it with tractors and these big farming implements. During that time, in the 1950s, is really when home canning kind of combined with the victory garden really took off. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, we've kind of seen a shift away from that and kind of going back to things like raised beds and square foot gardening and these smaller types of gardens as people have moved into areas with smaller plots of land. What we're going to be looking at in this episode is a new way of gardening, and it's kind of taking, something like a raised bed where you've got all your vegetables right in one spot. Why not take that and incorporate it into the landscape? So why not mix your ornamental plants with your vegetables? For that matter, why does your garden need to be in the backyard? You can plant something beautiful like Swiss chard as an ornamental in your front yard. And this new system, it's called Foodscaping. For this episode, all the way back in January, I reached out to an author who wrote an entire book on foodscapes about the topic. And her name is Brie Arthur. No, Brie Arthur.
Well, my name is Brie Arthur, and I am a gardener in Central North Carolina, USDA Zone 7B. I actually grew up in southeastern Michigan, and I was introduced to the hobby and art of horticulture through my local 4-H group. And I'm so grateful for everything that I learned in 4-H, because it truly had a massive impact on my life, my career, and my ambitions for the future.
Okay, and you've written a book. It's called The Foodscape Revolution. If you could, kind of give us a description of what a foodscape is.
Absolutely. So foodscaping is simply just the integration of edibles in an ornamental space, including landscapes and containers. And really, it's just a fancy word for a long time style very well described in the writings of Rosalind Creasy, a dear friend and mentor of mine, who's written 23 books on the subject of edible landscaping. The whole point of writing the book, The Foodscape Revolution, was to share my journey as a home gardener dealing with restrictive covenants from my homeowner association. We're living in a time where they say no vegetables in your front yard, but often that's the only place that you can cultivate food crops because of sun exposure. So I wanted to share some tips and strategies to encourage and empower other people who live in suburban developments but don't quite feel like they can break the rules. And foodscaping really enables people to essentially hide their vegetables in plain sight by incorporating them with all of the flowering shrubs and trees and perennials that people are already used to seeing.
I thought it was interesting reading your book because I grew up on a 25-acre farm, but I've kind of moved into more of a suburban area, so I'm kind of approaching it sort of from the opposite direction, where I used to raise, a huge Victory-style garden with straight rows, and now I'm kind of being forced to downsize, so this is something that I can integrate into my own gardening around the house and kind of help me with downsizing my garden.
I am so thrilled to hear you say that. And that's really, what I hope people will discover from reading the book are the opportunities that your existing landscape offers. And, we do come from an agrarian society, so our tendency is to pretend that we're farmers. But the bottom line is, when you're living in a subdivision and you don't have equipment, you're not a farmer, you're a home gardener. And you don't have to plant in straight lines because you're not relying on a tractor to do the work for you. You can be more creative in how you incorporate vegetables in open areas of mulch space. That means you're harnessing the power of space that's already being managed.
Something else that I really thought was neat is how you can also sort of use edibles as companion plantings. I know I saw recently on your YouTube channel that you kind of used garlic along with planting your tulip bulbs to help fight, moles and voles. So that's another aspect, is that you can kind of bring in edible plants alongside ornamentals as a companion plant.
Absolutely. And, that's a really important point, because edibles offer, a tremendous amount of sustainability for native pollinators. They will typically flower at different times than your ornamentals. And from an ecosystem services perspective, edible plants really do deserve to be right there alongside with your native plants and your ornamentals. And in saying that, it's also really important to recognize that edibles don't have a tremendous amount of biological diversity. And what that means is typically Americans are really only growing edibles from 4 plant families. The Solanaceae family, which is your nightshade, Fabaceae, which are your beans, your legumes, Brassicaceae, which are all of these cool season crops, and Amaranthaceae, oddly enough, because Swiss chard has become so wildly popular as an ornamental edible. But when you segregate those plants into an isolated area, you've created a monoculture. And monocultures are problematic whether it's 48 square feet in a raised bed or 4,000 consecutive acres, basically putting a big exclamation point for insects and diseases. So when you intersperse your edibles within your biologically diverse range of landscape plants, you're actually going to help increase, basically beneficial insects that will come in and combat problem insects and ultimately reduce your disease pressure.
By kind of mixing in these plants and using this method, you can improve the soil around your house.
That's such an important thing to focus some time and energy on. And I think soil science is the great missing link between, landscapes and even home gardening practices. And crop rotations and utilizing grains and legumes to, improve soil structure and naturally add nutrients. These are all practical solutions that have been utilized by agronomic communities for centuries. and are for some reason missing in our home gardening practices. And I hope to be able to inspire and shed some light on how you can apply those ideas to your home landscape without seeming like a crazy person.
Yeah, I know. This past year, I've always grown grains as a cover crop, but I attempted to grow some spring wheat, and it was kind of a failed experiment for me in that I didn't actually get a harvest from it. And part of that was because I left for vacation like right when it needed to be harvested. But it was excellent to mow down and then till into the soil. And I can't wait to replant that section this year with something else and see what that's done to the soil.
You know, since I started really concentrating on growing grains, and not only growing them in mass, like what you would imagine a farmer's field would be, but, you know, related to a residential landscape, but also as clumps, so they mimic an ornamental grass, I have seen an incredible improvement in my soil. And, you know, one of my methodologies with growing grains is, you know, I first look at them going into spaces where I have compacted soil, because their fibrous roots can dig down 36 inches deep and really improve that soil structure. They scavenge for deep nutrients and actually bring nitrogen and potassium back up to the surface to make available for the other plants around them. Then I harvest just the seed, and I mow their biomass back in place and use that organic matter to build my soil for the next season. And now, going in my fourth year of doing this, I'm not having to rely on off-site substrates to improve my soil. I'm actually growing my own biomass and using it in place, and it's a far more sustainable approach to gardening, and it's made an incredible impact in reducing my need to irrigate and add fertilizer. It's also strengthened my plant's ability to grow strong and develop their own resistance to, you know, common diseases and insect infestations. So it all starts with healthy soil. And this idea of growing grains, you know, to help improve your soil is a really inexpensive, easy solution for a problem that most home gardeners face, especially those of us living in new developments where the ground is heavily compacted from all of the equipment that has run through in the process of building your neighborhood.
Talking about grains, I know you're working on a book on grains. Could you kind of give us a kind of a preview of it?
Absolutely. I am known online as the crazy grain lady, and it really has captured my attention in a way that I never would have anticipated. But I'm going to focus on 6 major cereal grains and the opportunities they can provide as home garden landscape plants. So I'm featuring 3 cool season crops, barley, oats, and wheat, and 3 warm season crops, corn, sorghum, and rice. And I've been, you know, uncovering their amazing histories and the different applications that have been utilized culturally across the globe with all of these plants. And then, you know, trying to really dissect practical ideas that home gardeners can take from this. And, you know, from containers to, you know, dynamic foundation landscapes to property borders, all of these seasonal grains offer an incredible amount of beauty, ecosystem services, and, you know, edible components that are really outside of the box. So I'm thrilled to be in the final stages of getting the chapters finished and look forward to its debut this fall.
Okay, so we can look for that book this fall. And right now you've got the Foodscape Revolution that's out. And I've read it. I love it. I especially like the recipes at the end of the book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a huge fan of home canning. My wife and I, we do 50 or so quarts of green beans every year, and then we freeze corn and a bunch of other vegetables, freeze tomatoes, and we're big fans of home preservation of food.
Well, I can tell a kindred spirit when I'm with one, and I didn't grow up doing this at all. And it's just a really enlightening experience to have as an adult. And, it's one of those things that once you've tried it, you realize that it's not as difficult and time consuming or scary as some people say. And, now I will often retort that, well, you can in the air conditioning with Netflix on. It's actually kind of a privilege. And I hope everyone will at least try it once, and especially with something that they love to eat, actually be able to grow it, preserve it, and change a habit in their grocery store shopping.
Yep. I always remember my grandmother. It'd be the middle of winter time, which I don't know when this episode's going to air. It'll probably be later in April or May. But right now we're in the middle of the big polar vortex. But I always remember Grandma in the middle of wintertime, she'd crack open a jar and you'd hear that hiss as it would open. And she'd be like, oh, it's a little bit of summer in the middle of winter. And, that's just a fond memory for me.
I did that last night when I made spaghetti sauce from tomatoes that I grew over the summer. And, it gave me hope in the end of January that a new season is going to be here. And in the meantime, I get to enjoy the flavors of my efforts from the last season. And, I think that there is a lot to be said for getting people to have experience that feels authentic and frankly raises the awareness and appreciation for resources that we often take for granted in today's times. And having access to food is extremely important, and it's fragile. And once you've cultivated crops for yourself, you have an appreciation that, simply can't be ignored. I think I want to thank a farmer every single day for their hard work and efforts in making food available to me. And I hope that everyone at some point in their life will discover that same level of gratitude and appreciate all that goes into making nutrition and available food access, available to all of us.
What would be a good way for people to find out more about you and ways that they could get in contact with you?
Well, you can visit my website, which is Brie Grows, and that's Brie like the cheese, BRIE, Grows, GROWS. You can also follow and subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is the same name, Brie Grows. And I am not a videographer. I'm just a passionate, enthusiastic home gardener wanting to share practical tips. I try to load 3 to 4 videos a month, basically giving you an update from my home foodscape and, relevant ideas and planting strategies to make your experience as beautiful and bountiful as possible.
Again, I would like to thank Brie for sharing this wonderful information on foodscaping. I really think it's something that's exciting, that's really going to take off. And, when it comes to exciting and gardening, those are two terms that you really don't hear that often together. But gardening can be exciting. Just a couple weeks ago, I was working out in my garden and came within about 3 inches of grabbing a snake. After jumping back and a nice scream, kind of like a girl, I noticed that, it was just a small garter snake and was perfectly harmless. That does bring me to this week's gardening wisdom. For this week, I thought it would be great to use a quote from Rosalind Creasy. And it comes from her 1982 book, Edible Landscaping, which is perfectly fitting. She writes, "Your garden may appear to be a quiet place, but in reality, it is an arena where hundreds of life and death dramas are played out every day. Birth and death, killing and nurturing, even intrigue and cunning are all part of the complex community of life waiting to be discovered, and sometimes struggled with in your garden." To me, that's a great quote. You can always go out in your garden And if you look close, you can see nature at work. And sometimes it's ugly. I mean, a ladybug attacking aphids, yeah, that's pretty brutal. But that's gardening. So until next time, let's make our garden exciting and keep growing. Visit us online at bobsmarket.com. And you can find the Keep Growing podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and more. And if you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks, feel free to email me at keepgrowing@bobsmarket.com. The music in this week's episode is by Silent Partner, and the Golden Girls instrumental cover is by Movie Man 95. Copyright 2019, Bob's Market and Greenhouses, Incorporated.